What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another episode of the Why Nobody Plays series. And we're going back to the well because, Innistrad has just given us some of the greatest cards that we have ever seen in Magic in like the 2010s era of sets. And this is going to be no different, as we are going to take a look at a card that I think kind of shifted the balance, or at least helped shift the balance of what was potential with the blue white archetype. Because at this point in Magic, in about the 2012s era of Magic, blue white has been exclusively tied to being just a control deck, a slow, methodical deck that is going to drown you in card advantage and one for one answers until you can basically do nothing, and then it's going to slam it down its home run threat and win the game over time. And now we're kind of seeing this shift in blue white where the deck actually kind of takes on sort of this mid-rangey role and even at times can be very aggressive, of course thanks to another card that we went over in this series in Delver of Secrets. And I think another creature that was a bit instrumental in kind of showing us that blue white could be this kind of aggressive archetype if built right is the card that we're going to be looking at today, which is a Geist of St. Traft. Now, Geist of St. Traft is a crazy card to kind of look at because I wouldn't say even for the time that players just kind of wondered how the heck you deal with it. And of course, we're going to be getting into the card and exactly what it does, and of course, some of the archetypes that it's seen throughout the history of its time in competitive Magic. And I cannot wait to get into any of that. But of course, before we get into the subject of today's video, if you're already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where I post mainly about the Modern and Pioneer format, as well as doing some other longer form content such as this one, if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell so you know when videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And if you want to support me even further, I do have a Discord server, which I have linked down in the description below. I have my Twitter handle if that's something that interests you as well. You can follow me on Twitter, especially as I kind of give some updates for Regional Championship Washington, D.C., as we kind of get closer to that event, which is going to be going on this weekend. Actually, the day that this is uploaded, the convention technically opens, but that's neither here nor there. And finally, the sponsor of the channel, or one of the sponsors of the channel, is Mana Traders. Mana Traders is a site where you can go and rent different Magic the Gathering cards for a variety of different formats based on your subscription tier. And with my link down in the description below, if you don't already have an account through Mana Traders, you can follow that link and you will be able to create a Mana Traders account and get 5% off your new account and be able to rent Magic cards and play some of the decks that I feature on this channel, as well as getting to compete in a monthly tournament where the format does vary. They recently did like a Commander event, I think like a few months ago. Of course, we see the usual suspects in Standard, Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, and even Vintage as well. They do kind of either a just a straight Swiss round, where you can just register for the event with whatever deck you choose to play and then start playing on a 2-day event. Or they have their own qualifier league in which you can win prizes based on your record playing at least 20 matches. And then on top of that, too, getting some pretty sweet prizes for a free tournament that you can just sign up for and play. So if that interests you, like I said, use my link in the description down below to create a new Mana Traders account where you can start renting your own cards on Magic Online and start competing in those tournaments and stuff. You get 5% off your account if you use my promo code, or I guess my link rather. So do appreciate it. Enough of that rambling and shelling out of the way. Let's go ahead, talk about Geist of St. Traft, and kind of look at the history of this card and why it gets the unfortunate distinction of, why nobody plays it. So here we have the namesake card of today's subject. We have Geist of St. Traft, a 1 generic, a white and a blue for a 2/2 legendary creature, Spirit Cleric, that has hexproof. So this creature cannot be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. And then whenever Geist of St. Traft attacks, you put a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. Exile that token at the end of combat. So a few things that kind of stick out for Geist of St. Traft is the fact that, again, it's in the blue-white colors, which is typically a color combination that feels a little bit slower, more methodical about how it wants to win the game. And we usually see, blue threats and blue-white threats in general just kind of being these more, high-costed things that end up doing quite a bit to kind of protect themselves. And Geist is noticeably cheaper at 3 mana. It is kind of aggressively sized. I mean, not necessarily aggressively sized, but just being a 3 mana 2/2 that has a relevant ability, meaning that you can't just kill it with some more common removal spells like we would see in things like Dismember in Standard, or things like Lightning Bolt, Path to Exile, Lightning Helix, and the Sword, and of course more getting up to like Fatal Push or whatever as we kind of get later into Modern's life cycle. So getting to dodge some very powerful removal spells. While the body itself isn't really that big, the fact that in these blue-white strategies, typically you'll be playing things like counter spells. You'll have different kinds of removal spells, and as we see later, introducing like a third color to this archetype to kind of give it a little bit more of a wider range of things to kind of have go on, where it can double for removal and as a way to close out the game. And that's exactly what Geist of St. Traft does. I mean, you attack with this 2/2, and then you get a 4/4 Angel that's going to be tapped and attacking. On an uncontested board, it's going to be able to deal 6 damage to your opponent, which in a lot of cases is going to be roughly a 3-turn clock. Of course, it's a 4-turn without your opponent really helping you or using it to burn, but more than likely with a lot of the other games that get played, this is going to more than likely be a 3-turn clock. And as we kind of see in the early days of Magic, like once this kind of comes down and like the blue-white deck is able to have like a relatively cheap answer for whatever threat that your opponent decides to play, we know in Standard that a lot of the time using your mana as efficiently as possible and just kind of like tapping out for some big threats is going to be the way that you have the easiest chance of beating a Geist of St. Traft, but then also with the answers that some of the decks, especially the Standard version of like Blue-White Delver that we're going to look at, had kind of these efficient answers for creatures on board that would stop the Geist of St. Traft from attacking, and then also having other spells to kind of follow up on the opponent's turn when they try to go and tap out to play their big thing, then they're going to be able to kind of get rid of it. Really, like the best way of getting rid of a Geist of St. Traft at the time, with how the Legend rule worked, was playing like your own Geist of St. Traft, because neither player could have one in play, so they would just both get Legend ruled out of the game, and that would be like a way that you could like remove a Geist of St. Traft without really targeting it. So that was definitely kind of bad for Geist itself. But of course, that rule has since changed, and we can have like 15 different Jaces as long as they all have a different name on the battlefield. So Geist of St. Traft definitely gets a little bit of a bonus as Magic has kind of developed the rules and everything like that. But nonetheless, aside from that, really, once a Geist kind of stuck on the battlefield, it was pretty hard to get rid of it. And we'll look at our first deck here. Of course, it's foray into Standard, into, at the time, one of the most played decks in the format, and obviously a very hard threat to deal with given kind of the texture of what the format kind of looked like. So we'll go ahead and take a look at Blue-White Delver for the Standard time about 2012 to 2013. So here we have Ben Friedman's Blue-White Delver list from the Star City Games Invitational in Atlanta all the way back in 2012, which is over about 12 years ago, I guess. Like technically not 12 years yet from the official date of this, but I mean pretty soon, depending on how long after you end up. Actually, no, it's actually over. I have my days mixed up. Night shift sucks. But anyway, Geist of St. Traft here. Obviously, it's called Blue-White Delver because I mean Delver of Secrets is probably one of the best one drops to be playing at the time, and this was like no exception. This is a 1-mana 1/1 that was going to turn into a 3/2 flyer, hopefully on turn 2, and then continue to kind of beat down your opponent. That's why you kind of see gut shots in here and like mental missteps, kind of tech towards making sure that this Delver of Secrets didn't resolve or stick around on the battlefield or transform. And then mental misstep could also just be kind of a hedge against like gut shot, things like that. Even like vapor snag too. There's like some good targets for like mental misstep. But nonetheless, a lot of the format was kind of revolved around like Delver and trying to either beat Delver or answer Delver. And when you have a whole format that's just like, here's a bunch of like targeted removal and some things like that for Delver of Secrets, a Geist of St. Traft, I feel like ends up being a very, very, very potent threat. So with a lot of this target removal, we see Dismembers, we see Vapor Snag, we see Gut Shot for these Delver of Secrets. Geist of St. Traft gets to essentially avoid all of that kerfuffle, if that's even a right word to use. Instead, just is like if this resolves onto the battle, if this gets onto the battlefield, you are not going to be able to answer this card effectively. You're not going to be able to use any of your removal. Obviously, if you're able to sneak it in under their counter magic as well, they're going to be in for a rough go of it because, again, they're going to have to try to play and resolve their own Geist of St. Traft. And really, I feel like it kind of benefits in a way the person that plays the first Geist of St. Traft, because then your opponent on their turn has to play their Geist while you're tapped out, and then you just get to go to your turn 4. You get to end up playing like a cantrip or leave up mana to like play a Restoration Angel, play a Snapcaster Mage, whatever the case may be. And of course, we have to think about it at the times here. So, really, what gets Geist to be like a really powerful card in this format is a few things. So, with the kind of abundance of like removal here, where we have Vapor Snag, just like return a creature to your opponent's hand when they spend 3-4 mana to play a creature and don't really have anything to show for it. Because remember, creatures don't necessarily suck. I mean, we're looking at some really good ones here right now, but creatures definitely aren't what they are in 2024. So like Vapor Snag, your opponent loses a life, like it's a little bit of tempo and sets them back all for 1 mana, and it means Geist Sustained Traft is going to be able to get into attack. And another thing that kind of puts Geist pretty high up is the fact of cards, like Sword of War and Peace and Runechanter's Pike. Runechanter's Pike in particular is very, very, very hurtful, I would say, to a lot of decks because you see, for Gitaxian Foe, Probe, for Ponder, you have Mana Leak, Vapor Snag, Dismember, Mental Misstep, Gut Shot, and Thought Scour of all things. Rootchanter's Pike is going to be able to be slapped on your Geist Sustained Traft. It's going to get like even, we'll say like +3/+0 and first strike. And it's getting that plus X, where X is the number of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard. So you just play like Ponder on turn 1, and then like Thought Scour and say Mental Misstep something on turn 2, whatever the case may be. You already have like quite a few cards in your graveyard already. You can play a Runechanter's Pike, play a Geist, slap the Runechanter's Pike on it. It's going to be like, we'll say like a 6/7 power threat that's going to make a 4/4, where now the Geist is one of the most threatening creatures on the board. 6/7 power first strike is very, very, very hard to deal with, as it turns out, in combat, especially when you have hexproof slapped on this creature. So you're not really going to have a lot of things. You're going to end up trading actual cards, 2 or 3 cards for a Geist of Saint Traft attack, which your opponent could just follow it up with another Geist of Saint Traft, and you're kind of in the same spot, except now you're down a board full of creatures, and then this Geist is going to be able to get in tons and tons of damage, because this deck is going to be able to play very well when kind of playing that kind of tempo strategy, thanks to cards like Mana Leak and Vapor Snag as well. So definitely what you would expect from a kind of blue-white aggressive deck. We have like Delver, Geist, Restoration Angel, all good enough. Snapcaster Mage, of course, we've went over on this series as well. Getting to flashback any one of these spells and essentially give you 4 more copies of all of these cards. And people finally picking up on Gitaxian Probe, at least in standard. The Gitaxian Probe is a pretty nutty card when you can just pay 2 life, get some information on your opponent's hand, see what you need to play around, see what you can play around, maybe what you can't play around, and then getting a card back for your troubles, all for the cost of 2 life. And really, for 1 blue mana, it's not a bad effect to have necessarily either. So this is kind of where Geist of Saint Traft kind of got its start. We'd seen a lot of people playing these blue-white Delver decks. I believe, according to MTG Top 8, that about 25% of the deck lists they have from this time period are blue-white Delver decks, just to kind of put that into perspective. So definitely a very potent strategy. Of course, I think a lot of it has to do with Delver of Secrets, but Geist of Saint Traft just is kind of the sneaky threat that, like, when it's on the battlefield, maybe you're not thinking about it. You're like, I gotta control the Delvers, my opponent's got Restoration Angel, Snapcaster Mage is so much value. Then they slam a Geist on turn 3, and you're like looking at your hand that doesn't have a Geist of Saint Traft, and it just is filled with like Vapor Snags and Dismembers and Mana Leaks and things like that. Now you're just like a oh fuck moment, like this card could easily just take over the game, and I have to kind of play threats into it. Like Snapcaster Mage ends up being like a decent one that you could play against like Geist of Saint Trap, but of course like it can just get countered. You can just Vapor Snag it. Like it doesn't end up getting anything like super relevant to kind of flashback that could end up directly dealing with the Geist of Saint Trap. It's just it gets messy. This is like all gets to be a mess because Geist is like this hard card to interact with, and then also adding the fact of like the supporting role kind of around this card as well makes it just a uniquely difficult threat at the time to kind of beat. And as we kind of see later, like it's not just a one-trick pony. You're not seeing it in these kind of like I would consider like tempo-y / control strategies. It actually showed up in some aggro decks as well, especially being played by probably one of the greatest players of all time. Now that we shift kind of towards the modern format, where Geist has seen a little bit of success in the modern format, as being a card too that I think for the format anyway. When you look past like the Tarmogoyfs and stuff of the format, Geist is a pretty aggressive creature that should be able to find a home somewhere in some sort of strategy, and it actually found it in one of the most unlikely places, given the fact of where we are starting with Geist of St. Traft. So I'm going to take you to the 2012 Players Championship and to Paulo Vitor Rosa's deck, where I believe he got to the semifinals of the Players Championship, which I believe at the time would then be considered like the World Championship under like kind of the old thing kind of going on. So let's go ahead and check out Paulo Vitor Rosa's deck featuring Geist of St. Traft. Here we have Paulo Vitor Rosa's Zoo deck list. Ended up losing to Yuya Watanabe in the semifinals, who was playing Jund, which I think was considered one of the best decks at the time. And it beat Shota Yasuoka playing a very, very sweet, like what they call Eternal Command, and that's a deck that I definitely want to look at some point because it's a deck that's pretty crazy. Like it's something that you can't do like nowadays. I think it's like too cute, too slow, but nonetheless like a really cool deck. But here we have the Zoo archetype. Now, when you hear people talk about Zoo in 2024, it's usually with kind of the ley line from the Murders of Karlov Manor set that, of course, just completely escapes me every time that I want to talk about it. Unless I'm not talking about it, then I know it. But that and Scion of Draco to kind of give your creatures a bunch of different keywords that are, super powerful and make it very hard to be able to interact with. But back in the day, these domain decks, these Zoo decks, were really just like really powerful creatures that were kind of above rate that could end up putting out tons of damage. So we see like the one drops. We have like Curd Ape, Loam Lion, Step Links. Curd Ape and Loam Lion got +1/+2 if you control a forest. So like Loam Lion and Curd Ape would be a 2/3 for 1 mana ideally, or for whatever. Like you play a Stomping Ground, you play Curd Ape, or you can play a Temple Garden and play Loam Lion, and it's a 2/3 on the first turn of the game. Step Links was another creature that was like really good in the early game because every time that a land would enter the battlefield under your control, it got +2/+2. So with a format, with all, essentially playing 12 fetch lands in this deck and a lot of one-ofs, actually 13 fetch lands because it's Marsh Flash, you could easily have a 4/5 attacking on turn 2 with Step Links, and when you throw in cards like Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix, and Tribal Flames, you could output tons and tons of damage on the very early turns of the game. Even like throwing in a Kazali Pride Mage, just right here, you're attacking with a 5/6 on turn 2. Pretty good stuff. And of course, it's a Zoo deck because, it's a bunch of cats. It's, you have Curd Ape, and then you have like Tarmogoyf, whatever. So here we have Geist of St. Traft as kind of like our very top of the curve, a 3-mana card that, it isn't even as big as a Curd Ape. Curd Ape and Loam Lion are bigger than a Geist of St. Traft, and you can play on turn 1. So what the heck is Geist of St. Traft doing here? Well, for the same reason why we'd seen those like blue-white Delver decks playing it, it closes out a game super quick. And well, it's not being backed up with, say, bounce spells and counter spells. We see it backed up by these burn spells and some of these other removal spells, and of course the burn spells being able to double as removal spells. We talked about Curd Ape and Loam Lion. They only get up to 3 toughness, so like Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix, deal with it just fine. Of course, Path to Exile as well, being a very good answer. With Jund, you had people playing like Dark Confidant and Tarmogoyf. Path to Exile is a very good answer for both of those cards, and of course, Helix and Bolt for the opposing Dark Confidants. There's just a lot of things that, Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix, Path to Exile dealt with straight up, of course, except for opposing Geist of St. Traft, which I believe still at this time. The Legend rule is still the same, so you can just Legend rule away your opponent's Geist with your own Geist. But, what we end up seeing here kind of in this main deck build and what Paulo decided to do was just play a lot of early aggressive creatures, and then, like, instead of Geist kind of being expected to kind of, beat over the last however many points of damage, or, Delver Secrets flipping and getting to deal, 3, 6, 9 damage with that card. You have Curd Apes, Lone Lion, Step Links, Kazali Pride Mage, and Tarmogoyf that were going to deal damage in mass to where you didn't necessarily need the Geist of St. Traft, but if the Geist of St. Traft got to stick on the battlefield, you play your 4th land, you attack with a Geist, it gets blocked. Who cares? You hit your opponent with the Angel. That's 4 damage that's getting through. Tribal Flames your opponent's face. That's another 5 damage. That's a 9. And then Lightning Helix, 12. You deal 12 damage on turn 4 with just a Geist and 2 burn spells, which is sometimes enough to win the game. With Kazali Pride Mage, you can attack with just the Geist of St. Traft. It's going to be a 3/3, which then outsizes the Curd Apes and the Loam Lions, and forces your opponent to leave a fetch land uncracked for Step Links to be able to block it, but even then doesn't actually kill it. So they need like 2 uncracked fetch lands to be able to beat it in combat. It was just like this is where Geist, instead of being like the 1-2 punch to something like maybe we would see in like blue white, where this is like a card that's going to be that you have to have an answer for. It's kind of like your opponent uses all their path to path to exiles and everything like that. They clear all the creatures, and now it's like I got to figure out what to do with the Geist of Saint Traft because this is going to attack with a 4/4. The 4/4 is not going to die to Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix. It's going to dodge Tribal Flames because it's going to get exiled at the end of combat. Not that you would even use a Tribal Flames on an Angel. You're probably just better going up to the face. And if you use Path to Exile on an Angel to kind of like stem the bleeding, I mean, this deck does still have some, 3 different basic lay-ins. Like, you're going to end up ramping this deck. And while more mana isn't necessarily what you want to be doing, what you don't want to have like 5, 6, 7 mana, you can certainly, find uses by just overwhelming your opponent by playing a bunch of these threats out, And looking at the sideboard too, we see like Thrun the Last Troll being just another hexproof threat that you have to try to contend with. Pyroclasm, is like one really good way of getting rid of Geist of Saint Trap because obviously you're going to get around the hexproof by just dealing 2 damage to everything. And of course, your Crude Apes and Lobe Lions were going to be able to live. More than likely, your Step Links as well. And even like Elspeth Knight Errant, just getting to give it +3/+3 and flying until end of turn. You're going to have a 5-power Geist attacking with a 4/4 Angel. It's going to be pretty good. So it just definitely a different take on what a deck featuring Geist of Saint Traft could really be. Of course, it could be argued that Geist of Saint Traft really isn't the idea of what like this deck's going for. It's obviously trying to win the game very quickly with a bunch of cheap, efficient creatures and using burn spells to kind of finish off your opponent. But even if that doesn't work out, you have Geist of Saint Traft as like a way to kind of suspend 4 damage. And if it ever gets in more than just one attack, like kind of how the theme is going to be of Geist of Saint Traft, if it ever gets in one more attack, more than one attack, it's going to be an absolute beating to your opponent, and they're going to have to come up with some creative ways of actually beating it. So that is kind of the Geist of Saint Traft in a little bit of a different shell than say like a control shell. But kind of as Magic has went on, these zoo decks have kind of went away from Geist of Saint Traft and found different ways. Wild Nacatl, I believe, was banned in this tournament, so you don't see Wild Nacatl here. And I believe that would kind of like take the place of Geist because then you could just play a few less lands and just play another 1-drop that can end up being a 3 on turn 1. But nonetheless, this is where we kind of saw Geist get its feet wet in Modern. And as we kind of move on, we see a little bit more of a traditional role of what we would expect from a blue-white card, even though like the first 2 decks kind of break the norm of what a blue-white X deck could end up being, even if Zoo isn't necessarily technically a blue-white deck. So let's go ahead. We're going to zoom over to 2015 and look at what a Geist of Saint Traft deck would have looked like at that time. So here we have a trial from GP Porto Alegre, which I hope I did not absolutely just butcher that name. But this is in 2015, and this is a what we call a blue, white, red mid-range. So as we kind of would typically see like blue white decks playing a lot of like we see like Path to Exile here, we see Bolt, Helix, Electrolyze, Remand, Mana Leaks, things like that. This is a deck that in the true definition of a mid-range deck could kind of play both sides. All right, so we had like the controlling side of it where we're going to play Mana Leak, we're going to play Electrolyze, we're going to play this game where I have cheap, efficient, counter spells. I have ways that like my spells are going to give me some value and they're going to draw cards. Helix is going to help me kind of live a little bit longer. We have Restoration Angel to kind of get some value from cards like Vendilion Click and Snapcaster Mage, even like Thundermaw Hellkite as well to kind of protect those cards, but then, like I said, also get some value out of it. Same thing with Aven Mind Sensor. Your opponent's playing fetch lands or they're, getting to search things off of your Path to Exile. They're not going to be able to look very deep, and more than likely, Path to Exile is just going to be a straight up removal spell where you're just going to get to exile their threat and they're going to get no value from it, or they're not going to be able to find any cards with their fetch land. Aven Mind Sensor was particularly brutal and I believe a very expensive card back in the day as well. But nonetheless, this is kind of what we're seeing these like blue, white, red decks kind of take shape as being more mid-range decks instead of being like these typical kind of control decks. So Geist kind of fits in this plan for a lot of the same reasons. It's a threat that you're going to play in a format with Lightning Bolt, Path to Exile, Electrolyze, Lightning Helix, and things of that nature. that this is just going to be able to dodge all of that removal just for the fact of being hexproof. It's going to be a pretty cheap threat, so you could play this on like turn 5 or turn 6, and then you end up leaving up an Electrolyze or Remand, Mana Leak, Path to Exile, Lightning Bolt, whatever. There's like a plethora of things that you can do. Heck, even with another 3 mana up, you could like leave up Snap Bolt for something and clear the way for this Geist Sustain Traft to kind of get through. 2015, I also believe, was like around the time that like Pod was, Pod and the Splinter Twin decks were pretty popular. Of course, there were other decks in the format, but that's the stuff that people really like playing, and stuff that people really want to go back when they talk about, peak modern. If they're not talking about the late 2010s, they're talking about the mid 2010s. But this deck in particular, could be pretty good against them. And of course, when you have Pod, they can kind of set up this chain that they're going to be able to climb all the way up and essentially have like an infinite damage combo. And then you have the Splinter Twin decks essentially trying to do the same thing. You want these very efficient answers to those things, and you want to close out the game very quickly. And that's exactly what Geist Sustain Traft offers you when you kind of sneak this in under your control opponent, or in the case of something like a pod deck, Geist is going to be a little bit worse because they just have a bunch of dumb small creatures. But Geist can kind of beat through some of them, and whatever you can't actually win in combat against, you have Bolt Path Helix. Even like Restoration Angel and like Vendilion Click end up being pretty decent because there's going to be flyers that are going to be able to get past what your opponent has and close out a game very quickly. But Geist, of course, is going to be one of the quickest ways to do so, as it can chunk in for 6 or hopefully at least 4 damage. We see like Thundermaw and Keranos here just kind of like a concession to the fact that if you end up playing in these like kind of control mirrors, these cards are just going to go way bigger than what your opponent has going on. Lingering Souls is a very annoying card, so like Thundermaw Hellkite getting to come down and ping all of your opponent's Lingering Souls tokens as well allows you to get in an attack with Thundermaw Hellkite and also get in an attack with Geist Sustain Traft as well to kind of make life very annoying for them. And when we go to the sideboard here, we kind of see some of these things where, like Anger of the Gods ends up being a good answer, Supreme Verdict ends up being a good answer for opposing Geist Sustain Trafts. We see cards like Engineer Explosives that can do the same thing, Wrath of God, of course. But these cards also just being very good when you just need to more or less play more like a control deck and less like this kind of mid-range deck where I can choose to be aggressive in the matchups where I need to be, where you can cut some of this other extra like counter spells and stuff, and interact a little bit more with the graveyard. Anger of the Gods kind of sweep things away. All in all, just kind of some interesting things kind of going on in this deck. Of course, we see 4 Celestial Colonnade is like another way to end the game, another flyer that can end the game. And then Agajo Castle is also pretty sweet because you can just target your Geist Sustain Traft with this, or even like your Vendilion Click as well, like preventing the next 2 damage. Definitely pretty good when people try to electrolyze the Vendilion Click and they kind of get got by Aganjo. But nonetheless, Geist Sustain Traft is something that you can attack with this. Your opponent has like a 2-3 power creature. You're going to be able to beat past it. They're going to have like a 4 power creature to be able to beat the Geist Sustain Traft in combat. So that's a pretty neat thing. But that's kind of what these blue-red mid-range decks, or blue-white-red mid-range decks kind of came to, is just playing this half control-y, half I can play out pretty aggressive. And then as kind of the game goes on, I can go bigger if I need to beat some of the other decks like in the mirror match, or even some of the other control decks I have some game against. And then against the aggressive decks as well, the fact that these are only one-ofs, chances are you're not really going to see these sort of things, but cards like Spell Snare and then like Snapcaster Mage getting back all these removal spells are also going to make it life pretty difficult for them. All kind of centered around a little bit of like these flyers here, where they're going to be able to kind of come down, do their thing, and end the game very quickly before your opponent is able to overwhelm you. So really neat there. And we have one more deck list that we're going to look at, which is kind of like the end of the line for Geist Sustain Traft. And I would say it's a hell of a way to go out, to be all honest with you. Here we are. We go all the way to 2017. We have the SCG Classic in Baltimore. Jonathan Rossum, which I believe there's like simply for the fact that people at the time were really into playing Death Shadow. Death Shadow was one of the best decks to be playing in the format. It had game against everything. And Blue White was a very tough matchup, and by extension, Blue White control ended up feeling pretty bad for a few reasons. You had, essentially these very efficient answers. You had like Logic Knots and Spell Snares that you could play and kind of catch your opponent off guard. And counter some of their key spells. Spell Queller gave you a little bit, offered a little bit more as like an efficient flyer that was going to end up capturing a spell, and your opponent was going to have to use a removal spell. Very good against opposing counter spells because you were going to be able to take a counter spell from your opponent, and then if they killed it, they just didn't get to use the counter spell unless that counter spell was like Cryptic Command or something like that. On top of that, too, with the Death Shadow decks being very popular in the format, Bolt, Helix, and then like snapping Bolt or Helix, and even like Electrolyzes was going to give you so much value, and it could just honestly close out a game out of nowhere. We talked about like Geist plus like the burn spells being very powerful. This is it. I mean, you attack with a Geist, and then you like Helix Snap Helix or Bolt Snap Bolt is something you can do on like turn 4. That's 10 damage right there with just the Geist of Saint Traft. If your Death Shadow opponent basically made a 3/3 Death Shadow, they're at 10 life. They're just dead to that. They're just dead to that line of play. Of course, like the format was pretty diverse at the time, and I think that blue, white, red had a lot of the threats that were just very good, that lined up very nicely. And as we see from Control decks today, they had like this option where you could just end the game early. You could just keep things off the board, and Geist was going to be able to swoop in and just end up dealing tons and tons of damage until your opponent ended up dying. I also think people took a lot of liberties with their life total, so that you would see a lot of people like shocking lands into play, fetch shock, and kind of put themselves down to some pretty low life totals where one attack with a Geist, they end up killing the Geist in blocks, but then you get to get in the hit with the Angel. They go from 15 to 11, and now they're like 3 burn spells away, or a Snapcaster Mage hit plus 3 burn spells away from dying at that point, which is pretty big. And then of course they have to answer these other Geist of Saint Traps as well, and when you get to a point where you're kind of top decking, Geist of Saint Traft gets in a pretty neat position, because then your opponent ends up having to answer it with a creature of their own, which then could potentially get bolted, pathed, helixed, whatever, and then all of a sudden it's cleared out of the way and you're getting in. Your opponent gums up the board with a lot of creatures, a Cryptic Command, tap them all down, attack with your Geist, deal a ton of damage. You could even just do this on the end step, tap your opponent's team, draw a card. Untap, you have all of your mana, and then you get to Geist, hit them and attack for 6, and then life is just ends up being very difficult for your opponent. And like these decks at the time were so annoying to deal with because they just generated so much value thanks to Snapcaster Mage back when it was like a really good card. Bolt and Helix were good ways to kind of like close out the game, and Geist of Saint Traft just kind of being the creature that your opponents really couldn't effectively deal with because it had X-Proof. And if you just played a creature, well, guess what? You're playing against the 4-path, 4 Snapcaster Mage deck, and then also playing like Bolt and Helix, which killed a good amount, killed enough of the format to just be a good, efficient answer to then be able to leave up like Logic Knot on the next turn to answer a potential sweeper, or even answer a potential threat that your opponent could play on the other side. So that's essentially kind of the history of Geist of St. Traft. We kind of get to the modern times now, and it's a card that's kind of fallen out of favor. And of course, up until I would say recently, blue white and blue white X like control decks went from being just kind of like you can play these, but there's definitely a lot better things to be doing in the format, to like these 4 and 5 color mid-range piles that were obviously using Yorion and all the pitch elementals to kind of just grind your opponent into paste, and of course using cards like Up the Beanstalk, to now we see these Jeskai control decks and like these blue black decks that are some playing the ring, some not playing the ring, and getting to basically find ways to end the game even faster with something like a Flage, which kind of takes that role of a Geist of Saint Traft. So with that said, and I guess a little bit of a spoiler here, let's go ahead and give our final thoughts on the card of Geist of Saint Traft. So we've made it to the end of the video. So why exactly is Geist of Saint Traft not played? Pretty simple. This card just no longer is good anymore in the archetypes that would want to play it, especially in modern. I think the format is not even necessarily too fast, but there's just so much value that you get. I think that you have to be kind of like one of these control decks that are able to kind of like X for one your opponent, like more than just 1 for 1. I think you have to like 2 for 1 them a decent amount to kind of get Geist of St. Traft to stick on the battlefield. And then there's just other things that you kind of have to play to kind of get this to work, where you get in more than one attack. And I think that's the big thing, is if Geist gets in, 2, 3 attacks, it ends up feeling really good. But if it gets in one attack or doesn't get to attack at all, you feel like you've done nothing. Where at least something like, say, Flage comes in, it gets 2 lightning helix something, and it gets sacrificed, and then it's a threat that basically when your opponent is out of answers, when you're kind of playing your other cards or you're answering their answers, or you get to a point where you get to play this card again from your graveyard, your opponent isn't going to have a very good time or a very good answer for that card immediately, because you're going to also be able to kind of back it up as well, with the added benefit of also giving it haste thanks to Arena Glory seeing play in some of the Jeskai control decks. Flage is just an amazing option, and where you could play Geist of St. Traft in some of these decks, or potentially find ways to play it, you're just better off playing Flage, because over the long term it's going to be a lot better of a card. And even the effect of just like getting something off the board or hitting your opponent for 3 and then you gaining 3 life can add up over the course of a game, where you gain 6, 9, 12 life, especially in a format where we see a lot of the One Ring seeing play. Is just going to be a lot better for a lot friendlier to someone like a Flage rather than Guys of St. Traft. So, of course, like the typical answer is going to be power creep. Guys of St. Traft just can't keep up with the modern format currently. Could it be something that sees Pioneer play? Potentially. I think that the current format is like not necessarily unkind to Guys of St. Traft. I think that there's ways that you can kind of build and play this. High Noon is a card that's seeing a lot of play in the Pioneer format currently as the recording of this video. So something like High Noon into a Geist of St. Traft, and you're able to like fade a turn of your opponent playing something like a Pyroclasm or some kind of like sweeper effect, then you can just kind of, take your very cheap and efficient interaction, boom, get a creature out of the way, get an attack in with Geist. Oh, use your mana that you have left to either kill or counter the next threat that they play, because then they can't really overwhelm you with a High Noon, and then attack with a Geist, and kind of get to continue to do the same thing, where you're going to have these efficient answers for what your opponent could potentially have for a Geist of St. Traft, and you're going to be able to kind of like narrow them down, where they're going to have to play some really powerful, really good threats to answer Geist of St. Traft, and they're going to have to be able to also be hexproof threats that potentially can't be countered, and that's just going to make life very hard for people. So could Geist succeed in something like a Pioneer? Potentially. Could it be a standard card? Perhaps. We saw Delver Secrets be played in standard, and it really didn't see that much play, if at all. So it could be the time for Guys of St. Traft to kind of return and be kind of this card that can, see some play in in something like Pioneer, to kind of give it some new life. And I think that's kind of where we should look at Pioneer with some of these things. And crazy enough, I think I have a video that's related to potentially printing cards like Geist of St. Traft into the format that don't really have a home in some of the other Eternal formats, to kind of give it new life and let players kind of experiment and play with cards that used to be good back in the day, and give them a chance now. But as always, that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what card you would like to see next in this series, or if you have any good, fond memories with Geist of St. Traft, or bad ones. I'm here for all the bad beat and or good beat stories down in the comments below with this card, or any other experiences, things like that, that you can give. I would greatly appreciate. Of course, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, all that fun stuff. Join the Discord server, follow me on Twitter. Still all great stuff. But yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.